Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 14, in which Johanna and I discuss the 4 parts of the Viking soul. So people in the Norse world had a very different way of looking at what makes up a person, like who they are and what they are. So in our Western world, in our Judeo-Christian viewpoint, we have a body and we have a soul or spirit, whatever you want to call it. When we die, that soul moves on while the body remains behind. But that's not how the pre-Christian pagan Vikings viewed things, and that's what Johanna and I will dive into in this episode. I'm K.S. Barton, the author of the Norse Family Trilogy, the story of a young woman and a young Viking warrior caught in the middle of a deadly blood feud. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello. I'm Johanna Wittenberg, author of the Norse Women series, the story of a real Norse queen who ruled alone for nearly 20 years. In the early 9th century.
All right. And you have some intricate knowledge of this because you have some of these things that they believed in your books.
Yes, I do.
It's very cool. So I just want to, as we're talking about these 4 aspects of the soul, in his book, Children of Ash and Elm, Viking scholar and archaeologist Neil Price calls this the fourfold division of being, which I thought was a really good description of what it is.
Yes.
And these 4 parts are the hamr, that's H-A-M-R, the hugr, H-U-G-R, the hamingja, and the fylgja. Hopefully I'm saying those okay.
I think you are.
That's what the 4 of them are. And so now we're going to get into them individually. Unless you had something to add?
No.
Okay. So the hamr, this is probably the easiest one to describe, I think. So the hamr is the physical manifestation of a person. So it's your body that you walk around in and you sleep in, everything you do, it's that outer shell. Unlike us, the Vikings believed that this physical form could change, like shape-shifting kind of changing. So, and they believed that certain people, certain special people could shift into another form. And that form was usually an animal. They could shift at like a certain time of day, like maybe at night, or a certain time of the year. Think of werewolves shifting during the full moon. They could shift when they're angry, when scared, when excited, when at ease. Some, I think, could just shift at will. And these people were considered very special.
They were, and there was actually a name for what they were. They were called hamr, which means shape strong.
Oh,
that's the word the Vikings used to describe people who could shape shift.
Shape strong. Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
And both men and women could do this. Men were more likely to shift into predators like wolves or bears. And women were more likely to shift into birds, even though they would often shift into predatory birds like falcons or water. And, and I was reading in his book that he said water animals. I don't remember any stories of a woman's shifting into like a seal or anything like that.
Neither do. Well, yes, there is one where a vulva shifts into the shape of a walrus.
Oh, okay.
That's not, it's not a fish, but it is a walrus. But also, they also shift into boars or swine because in honor of Freya.
That's right. But doing the shape-shifting wasn't without risk, because if you were in the shape of your animal and something happened, especially if you were killed, then you would die as well.
Well, and in Cormac's saga, a sorceress attacks Cormac's ship in the shape of a walrus, as we just talked about. And when Cormac kills the walrus, the vulva back home also dies. And there's another saga, which I can barely pronounce, but I'll give it a shot. Fridtjofs. Fridtjof's saga. I'm sure that's completely butchered. A king named Helgi hired two volur to sink his ship. And from their safe platform, the sorceresses went into a trance, and they sent a great storm after the hero's ship. But when Fridtjof climbed the mast, he could see a great whale circling the ship and two women riding on its back. So it's a little bit different than shape-shifting. It's kind of astral projection. So Fridtjof and his crew managed to spear these two women, and they disappeared. The whale submerged and the storm dissipated. But back on shore, they saw that while the two women were in their trance, they tumbled down from the Seithjaller, which is the Seith platform, and both of their backs were broken.
Wow.
So they were killed at the instant of their death on the whale. So that's a little bit different kind of a story where they're actually transporting themselves.
That's really cool. I have this great visual of that. You know, we've talked in a couple of episodes about the platform that these women would be on, and I can imagine them in like their garb, you know, their finest clothes, and maybe they have their wands with them, and there's probably they've eaten the ceremonial food and have the, you know, maybe taken something that puts them into that trance. And
nobody knows what these platforms looked like really, or how high they were, but they do talk about them climbing up on it. Sometimes there's a brazier on it or a chair. In my book, I have my sorceress Hyde. She has a special chair of prophecy that goes up on that. So it's in almost every saga mentions something about the Seith platform.
Yeah. And that also tells you that they were important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, sometimes they seem like they're outside. Sometimes it seems like they're indoors. You know, in a great hall, you would actually have room for one. It's hard to imagine because there aren't any depictions that we know of them either.
Well, I wonder if that's because when like Snorri Sturluson was writing all this down, Iceland was Christian, and they maybe didn't want to go into the details of how this was done as like to protect the people. Like, oh, let's write down these stories of our ancestors and keep them, but we're not going to give you any ideas on how to actually do this stuff.
It could be, but also doesn't seem to be any portrayals of them on the rune stones or in tapestries. I mean, there's just at least nothing that anyone has identified.
Yeah, but they're finding things all the time.
They are.
Was it that sword that somebody, I mean, if I lived in the UK or anywhere there, I would have a metal detector. People are always finding cool stuff. Like they just found a sword recently and their hoards they find. It's amazing.
I know, it's great.
All of England is just on top of a whole bunch of Viking hoards.
Yeah. Well, and also with the LiDAR scanning.
Oh, right.
That's so that they don't even have to excavate. They can pretty much see what's down under these mounds and in these areas where they suspect. Yeah, that's been in Scandinavia. They found a lot of things using the LiDAR.
Yeah, that's true. Some of the most famous shifters that most of our listeners have probably heard of are the warriors known as berserkers. And these warriors are special to Odin. And the name actually means bear shirt. Usually, and I've seen people who actually study the language say it could be bear, B-E-A-R, the animal bear, or it could be bear, B-A-R-E, like they're shirtless. Nobody's 100% sure, but it probably means bear as in the animal. And it's not clear if that name means they literally took on the form of a bear or if they wore the pelt of a bear, on top of them or something. Either way, they went into some kind of a trance-like state in a battle rage where they became nearly immune to blows. And there's some people speculate that they were perhaps under the influence of a hallucinogenic drug like henbane or something like that. And that's what caused the frenzy and their inability to feel pain in the moment. I mean, there are plenty of drugs now that can make somebody not feel pain or
Right.
go into some kind of frenzy and then have no idea what's happening, not feel pain until it's all over. So it's perfectly logical to me that they could have had something like that back then too. And in most of the stories, the berserkers traveled in groups of 12. And in episode 1, we talked about the shield maiden Hervor and her father, and Gunther was a berserker, and he traveled with his 11 brothers. So there were 12 of them. And they're usually bad guys.
Yeah.
People don't trust the berserkers, or they do things like they come into town and then they challenge, I want this woman, and they'll challenge her father to a duel, and they often cause trouble.
Yes, and sometimes they do this in order to take someone's land or take all their possessions. They'll challenge an ordinary person, an ordinary man, to a holmgang, and then just kill them and take everything they own. And that they became quite a threat to normal society.
And then there were the Ulfhednar. These were the warriors who turned into wolves. They're very similar to the berserkers, except, of course, they turned into wolves or wore wolf pelts rather than the bears. And they were also special to Odin. And they were also feared by ordinary warriors. I don't think there's as many stories of the Ulfhednar as there are berserkers.
No, the only one I can really think of is Kveldulf, which was Eagle Skallagrimsson's father, and he was a shapeshifter. Kveldulf means evening wolf. So he did shift. They don't explicitly talk about it, but they do discuss, him going into a berserker rage and then being very weak afterwards. That was part of the berserker.
That's right.
The berserker thing. This might be a good place for me to mention the Oseberg tapestry. I was going to talk about it later, but it seems really appropriate right now. So the whole thing about whether they were bear shirts or bear shirts, the Oseberg tapestry does portray men and women in costumes. For example, there are men in bear suits in the tapestry. Mm-hmm. There are women dressed as boars. And they look, some of them, like the women, you can see their skirt trailing behind them. They have a boar's head and body. So there's no way to know for sure if these tapestries are portraying them transforming or if they're dressing in costumes. In my last book, Queen of War, I do have them engage in a ceremony where they're dressing up in these costumes and accessing the spirit of this animal, this totem animal. But they do definitely show these men and women. They're armed usually. They have either spears or swords. So they're not naked. They're not bare-chested. There is a man in a bear suit, or two men in a bear suit, and they have spears. There are women dressed as boars carrying shields. And then they also have shield maidens who are not animals. They're just people. So anyway, I thought this was a good place to interject that because the Oseberg tapestries have really been ignored, and yet they're our best portrayal of these people and what they wore and some of their activities. So unfortunately, there's a newer book out about the Oseberg tapestries by Marianne Videller that is excellent, but a little hard to get a hold of.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And I wonder if they're going into some kind of a trance.
Yes.
If they really start moving like the animal, if other people are also in a trance and see them like that, this could be a communal thing that they're doing that wouldn't explain the battles, but it would explain some other ceremonial aspects of it.
Well, and this was in preparation for the battle. And of course, we have the famous story in Rolf's saga Kraki, where Bjorn transforms into a bear and he's fighting. He's asleep in his tent, but there's this enormous bear who's fighting in the battle, and someone comes and wakes him up, and the bear disappears and they lose.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's a lot of unanswered questions, but it's very intriguing,
It
really.
is very intriguing. Bjorn means bear.
Right.
It is very intriguing.
But
Well, and it's not just the humans and warriors and witches and sorceresses and people who did this kind of stuff. The gods, there's a lot of shape-shifting going on in the world of the gods.
yes, there are, and there's quite a few very entertaining stories. So the Old Norse term for shape-shifting was skipta homum, which means changing shape or changing your hugr, which is, as we said,
Hamr.
yeah, sorry, hamr. That's your body, your skin. It could be skin, body. There's a lot of different interpretations for it. So in the Ynglinga saga, Snorri Sturluson says Odin could change his shape, his hamr, when his body would lie there as if asleep or dead, while he himself was a bird or an animal and would travel in an instant to far off lands on his errands. So the goddesses Frigg and Freya had magical costumes. And in Old Norse, they were called fjarth hamr, which is literally the skin or shape made of feathers. Mm. And that enabled the wearer to fly. Whether this implies shape-shifting or actually putting on a costume or a cloak is not really known, but it's often interpreted as a feather cloak. And Freya is famous for having a falcon cloak. And Loki borrowed this item quite a few times when he needed to fly. In stories like one time he had to retrieve Thor's hammer from Jotunheim. Another time he had to rescue the goddess Idun and her golden apples from the Jotun Thjatsi.
Well, I also have to mention it was Loki's fault to begin with that the hammer was in Jotunheim and that the golden apples were stolen.
Everything's always Loki's fault.
It was always his fault. And then the gods would find out and then he would have to go make it right or as right as he could.
It was very generous of Freya to loan him her cloak.
That's interesting because Loki could shapeshift.
Yep.
So why would he have to borrow her cloak? I guess just for the story.
To fly. He wasn't able to fly. He could shapeshift, but so there's something about this cloak. The gods couldn't just fly. They had to put on this cloak. Of course, like you said, it's a story. So
yeah, it makes it fun.
Yeah, there's not necessarily logic here. The Valkyries were also said to have cloaks of swan feathers. So, and of course, the Valkyries are connected with Freya as well as Odin. So in the epic poem Volundar, he and his two brothers are out hunting and they find three Valkyries who had taken off their swan cloaks, which is called Alfdarhamr, which is swan skin, in order to bathe, or swan body. So the brothers stole the cloaks and hid them and took these three maidens to wife. They lived together for 7 years until the women found their cloaks. They donned them and flew off, which sort of implies the Valkyries were not really willing wives.
No.
But perhaps they were captives. We don't know. Two of the brothers set off to find their wives, but Volundar believed that his bride, Svanhvit, which means swan white, would come back to him voluntarily. And while he waited for her return, he forged hundreds of precious rings. I think there were 200 of them. Mm. Well, meanwhile, an evil king knew he was alone and he captured him. The king hamstrung Volundar, so he was crippled, and held him captive, forcing this smith to make precious objects for the royal family. But Volundar took his revenge. He killed the king's sons and made drinking cups of their skulls. He impregnated...
very Game of Thrones of him.
You know where it came from.
Right.
He impregnated the daughter of the king, and then he made himself some kind of wings that enabled him to escape. We don't know a lot. The translation is confused, so we don't know whether he just made some mechanical wings. But in one version of the story, his brother Eagle went out and shot a bunch of birds and collected their feathers and somehow got them to Volander for him to make his wings.
Hmm.
So there's this story is also Wayland the Smith in Anglo-Saxon. So it's a widespread story, and there's different versions of it. But it's definitely a shape-shifting story.
While you were talking about that, it reminded me of the Greek story of Daedalus and Icarus. He was a great craftsman, and so he was taken by a king and held against his will, so he would do stuff for him, and then he made his wings, and then Icarus used them to escape, and the whole story of that's the flying too close to the sun and all of that. But it's a very similar structure to this story.
It is. And, there's no doubt that the Scandinavians had contact with Rome for sure. They were never invaded, but many of their battle strategies were Roman. And there's some thoughts that even the runes may have been, taken from their form of writing. Nobody knows for sure, but there is definitely some contact. So these myths may have originated with the Greeks and the Romans.
Or it could just be one of those things that just kind of is in our collective unconscious, a story about somebody who was really gifted at something, and a greedy king takes him and keeps him prisoner to do what he wants to do. And he escapes by his own wits or creating something. So that could also, there's not that many stories in the world, or this, structures for stories. There's it's just how each culture, each person constructs them. So poor Volander, that was a terrible story. But his revenge was pretty grim.
It was very grim. But that's a kind of a standard Scandinavian Viking age. And these are probably pre-Viking age.
Yeah, the same with one we'll just talk about later with the Volsung saga. That's also pre-Viking, but then there's a lot of crazy stuff in that story. But before we get to that, and there's another, we were just talking about Loki, and in the Gylfaginning, in the Prose Edda, there's a story where Loki transforms into a mare, into a horse. So this happened not long after the gods settled in Asgard. A smith turned up at their door and offered to build them a wall, and he would do this in one winter. And this is also just a little clue that the gods lived someplace where there was a winter. But there was a condition that no other man could help him. And then the payment he demanded to marry Freya.
Of course.
Poor Freya. She was always, these gods and giants were always showing up wanting to marry her. So this tricky smith was smart. He couldn't have another man help him, but he brought in his stallion to help him haul stones. And so the wall went up very quickly, too quickly for the gods. They were not happy, especially Freya. And they began to worry that they'd actually have to pay this smith what he demanded. So to slow things down, Loki turned himself into a mare to lure the stallion away from his work. So he must have been a very fetching horse. And it worked. The stallion was distracted, and the smith didn't finish the wall on time. And lo and behold, the mare gave birth to a gray horse with 8 legs.
Imagine that.
Yeah. Is there any other story where somebody is transformed into something else and then gives birth to something?
No, there are a number of stories where somebody swallows something and gives birth, but not anything quite like Loki's stunt here.
Yeah. That just came to my mind. I couldn't think of anything.
I can't think of anything.
Yeah. And this was the famous horse Sleipnir, which means the slipper, who Loki then gave to Odin. And Odin is often depicted on rune stones and other things riding this 8-legged horse. And then the smith turned out to be a Jotun, so the gods no longer felt they had to abide by any agreement because he had tricked them first. So Thor hit him over the head with his hammer and killed him.
As Thor is wont to do.
Oh, I love Thor. Just I
Just
always thought it was super interesting the difference between Odin and Thor. You know, here you have Odin, this sly, cunning god who would make deals with people that were very tricky sometimes. There was a story, I can't remember what it was, where he made a deal with a woman and she was pregnant at the time. I forget what he was offering her. And he said something about like, you'll give me what's between you and the cauldron or something. And then when she gave birth to the son, she had to like dedicate
oh,
the
I
son
don't
to
even know that
Odin.
story.
It just popped into my head and I can't remember the name of the story or even the character.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Ah,
but Odin was tricky like that. He would do things like that. He'd turn on a king in battle and anyway, but Thor just went around bashing people over the head.
and Thor was the much more popular god.
Well, yeah, it makes
Because
sense.
he was very straightforward
Yeah, he liked to drink and
and bash
bash.
things.
It's much more relatable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have another story of Loki. You know, I noticed that a lot of these stories, at least with Loki, have to do with Freya. Freya is always so often at the heart of these stories.
Yeah, that's true.
Somebody wants to marry her, or in this one, Loki tries to steal Freya's necklace Brisingamen, which is more like a torque than a necklace. But when Loki tried to get at it, Freya was sleeping. She was asleep on her bed, sleeping couch, whatever, and she was laying on the necklace in a way that he couldn't get to the clasp. So he turned himself into a fly or a flea, depends on the translation, which one, bit her neck, which made her turn over, and he was able to swipe the necklace. Lucky for her, the god Heimdall saw it happen, and he chased after Loki. Loki eventually transformed into a seal and tried to escape in the water, but Heimdall changed into another seal as well, and then they fought, Heimdall finally winning and returning the necklace. So I guess there's an instance of a couple of male gods turning into seals. And then there's the story of Ottar. This one also includes Freya. He needed to find out about he was very dedicated to her. He wanted to find out about his ancestors. So she took him to the Jotun Hindla. Yeah.
She was a vulva.
Oh, she was a vulva.
She was a Jotun vulva.
Okay. A Jotun vulva.
She was both.
Yeah. And so Freya turned him into a boar to disguise him to her boar. You know, now that we're talking about boars, I just wrote a couple of scenes this week in which a boar is prominent. And I think it's gonna stay important.
Absolutely.
And now I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense now. Yeah.
Well, and they were the boar was sacred to both Frey and Freya.
Mm-hmm.
Frey and Freyr. Freyer and Freya.
Right.
The twins.
I usually just call him Frey, just because it's easier than Freya and Freyr than Frey and Freya.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had the golden boar.
Yeah.
Gullinbursti. Yeah. He had some cool items. He had that golden boar, and then he had that ship.
The pocket boat.
Yes. That he could fold up and put in his pocket, but also was big enough to have everything.
Is that how
Skipbladner?
Something like
that. Yeah. So yes, but Odin could also shapeshift.
Yes, there's a story about him turning himself into an eagle in order to steal the mead of poetry. So this mead, it's a long, long story. So I'll kind of summarize the first part. The mead was made of the blood of Kveser, who was the wisest man in the world. And Kveser was created from the spit of the Vanir and the Esir when they spit in a vessel to seal their truce. And this fermented into a man. Kveser was murdered by two dwarfs, and they turned his blood into mead. And this mead contained Kveser's vast wisdom. Whoever drank it would become wise enough to be a scholar or a skald. So these dwarfs were homicidal. They went around committing more and more murders, and the Jotun Suttung sought revenge for the death of his parents. To save their lives, these dwarfs offered Suttung the mead of poetry as weregild. and he agreed. He took possession of 3 vats of this mead. Suttung gave the mead into the safekeeping of his daughter Gunnlod, and she kept it deep inside the mountain Nithbjori. So women were normally in charge of mead and ale, so it was appropriate for Gunnlod to take possession of it. Well, Odin heard about this, and he was forever in pursuit of wisdom, so he set out to take that mead. He knew Suttung had drunk of the mead and would never fall for his trickery because he was too clever. But Suttung's brother, Baugi, might be ripe to bend to his will. So first, Odin tricked Baugi's 9 servants into killing each other with their scythes. And that's an interesting story in and of itself. And then Odin, who disguised himself and called himself Bolverk, offered to work in exchange for a drink of Suttung's mead. Well, Baugi had suddenly found himself in desperate need of labor, and he agreed. So Bolverk did the work of 9 men, as agreed, and then he demanded his payment. Well, Baugi knew his brother would never agree to give up any of the mead, so he tried to renege on the deal, and Bolverk threatened Baugi. Well, Baugi realized that this man had just done the labor of 9 men, and he probably shouldn't cross him.
Yeah, seems pretty smart.
So Odin gave Baugi a drill named Rati and told him to bore into the mountain where the mead was being held. So Baugi drilled a hole into the mountain, and Odin turned himself into a snake. He slithered. Well, first Baugi tried to kill Odin with the drill because he knew his brother was going to be pretty pissed. But Odin eluded him, and he slithered into the hole and into the mountain where Gunnlod was guarding the mead of poetry. Once inside the mountain, Odin assumed the form of a very handsome man. He succeeded in seducing the lonely Gunnlod, and he slept with her for 3 nights in exchange for 3 drinks of the mead. But much to the Jotun maiden's distress, with each draught, her lover managed to empty an entire container. So by the time he was done taking his payment, he had all the mead inside of him. Mm. Then Odin transformed himself into an eagle, and he flew out of the mountain. Well, there's no explanation of how he flew out of the mountain, but he did. So Suttung heard his daughter's cries of distress, and he took the shape of an eagle and flew off in hot pursuit of Odin. When the Aesir saw Odin coming, they set out vessels in readiness to hold the mead, and when, in the nick of time, Odin arrived, he spat his treasure into them. But Odin dribbled a bit from his beak, and that fell on Middle Earth, where the Skalds and the law speakers were able to obtain some of it. But Suttung was so close to him that in his fear and haste, Odin leaked some of the mead from his anus.
Oh, lovely.
This was known as the rhymester's share.
Oh, my.
Those who drank from it became minor skalds, but not the pure inspiration of poetry that came from Odin's mouth that gave people true wisdom and sublime poetry. So
wow, that is a convoluted story.
That is, and it's even longer than that. I mean,
yeah,
I a lot of it.
I wonder if that's where we get our phrase, when somebody's talking out of their, what.
Yeah, I never thought about that. It makes a lot of sense.
Oh my, the rhymester's share. I need to keep that in mind.
That would probably make a very good insult at a feast.
Oh, yeah.
It really could, because they did a lot of that flightings where they would insult each other kind of in play. That would be a good flighting.
That's funny.
It is.
And it's very much like a fairy tale in the way, he has to get this unattainable elixir and he has to try all these different ways, but he can't do it. And there's a a maiden protecting it and an overbearing father who's protecting her and brothers. And it's very cool. It's a lot. And I guess fairy tales were originally pretty dark and pretty grim. So.
They were romanticized because, you didn't necessarily tell these stories to children. I mean, I don't know
Right.
how protected Viking age children were, but, a little later on, if you were going to tell these stories to children, you'd clean them up a bit, I would
Maybe.
think.
Unless you wanted to scare them. I mean, I know
Yeah.
some fairy tales were to scare children so they don't wander too far into the forest, or they
Yeah,
don't
like
go into
Hansel
the
and Gretel.
lake or whatever, because there's
Evil lurking.
creatures that'll come up and, snatch you. So,
Well, one other person, a human being, is the notorious sorceress Queen Gunhild. And she, is in Eagle Saga and several other sagas. And she was reputed to be a shapeshifter in quite a few of these sagas. I won't go into those stories because they're kind of implied rather than explicit. But she was considered she was a vulva and a shapeshifter is what is thought.
Well, it seemed like by the time that they were writing about her, that whole ability was not okay for women.
Outlawed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like Eagle could shapeshift, or do magic or whatever he wanted, but not her.
No. At least according to the people who wrote the stories down.
Right.
Who knows what the form was earlier.
Right. Well, there's another some other stories about humans who could shapeshift, and the Volsung saga is a very famous Viking Age saga, which actually went back to the pre-Viking Age. It probably went back to Germany, and it's one of the most famous. And there's a little note. So Volsung, who is kind of like the hero, the patriarch of this family, is the son of Siggy and Hugr, a couple we learned about in episode 8 when we discussed healers and midwives. So Siggy was the unfortunate woman who was pregnant for 6 years and then had her baby cut out of her. So her son was Volsung. He then married a Valkyrie and they had 10 children. Among them Signy and Sigmund. So there's going to be a lot of Sig names happening.
Just like Thor in Iceland.
Yes. So Volsung's daughter Signy had to marry a man named Siggeir, but on their wedding day at the wedding feast, he was snubbed by Signy's brother. And yes, like many Viking men, he knew how to hold a grudge. So actually, this feast was really cool because it's very King Arthur-like. A stranger who was basically Odin dressed in disguise comes and he thrusts a sword into a huge tree trunk that was actually growing up through the hall. And he was like, any man who, it's like only the bravest can retrieve this sword from the tree branch. And it was not Siggeir. So he was pretty upset. But anyway, Siggeir invited Signy's father and brothers for a feast. This was a few months later or so. And he ended up ambushing them the next morning after they arrived. Signy had tried to warn them, but Volsung, her father, shooed her away. Like, go back to your husband, stay loyal to your husband. We're not going to flee. We're not that kind. What kind of men would we be if we ran away?
Living ones.
Yes. So Siggeir, they had a big battle, and Siggeir killed Volsung, Signy's father, and then he took her brothers hostage. He planned to kill them right away, but she talked him into keeping them a little longer. She tried to convince them that it was, she just wanted to look on her brothers a little bit longer, but she was actually conniving, trying to figure out how to save them. So Siggeir tied them up, and then each night his mother turned into a wolf and ate one of the brothers. So she ate one brother per night, and this went on. I know. This went on for 8 nights. Apparently, it took that long for Signy to figure out how to save them. So the last brother surviving was Sigmund. And Signy snuck to him and gave him some clues on what to do to save himself, which is all kind of weird. And I won't get into it. But We'll just skip to he survives. And there's some more to the story, but I'll go ahead and get to the shape-shifting bit. If you want more of this story, which has all kinds of crazy stuff in it, it's the Volsung saga. Check it out if you want more. So Signy ended up having 2 children with her husband, but she did not think either one of them was brave enough to be a Volsung. They would cry when they were babies, and she didn't like that. So she figured the only man who could father a boy worthy of the Volsung bloodline was her brother, Sigmund.
Oh,
yeah, I know. Like I said earlier, very Game of Thrones.
mm-hmm.
So luckily for her, Signy just happened to encounter a witch around this time. And she asked the witch if she would change appearances with her. And this reminded me of the King Arthur story too. Remember when
Yes, when
what's his name? Oh geez. Arthur's father.
yeah.
Start with it. Didn't it start with a U? Ah. Oh my gosh.
That's terrible.
That's going to make me crazy. But they switched forms. So, yeah. So the witch agrees to do this. And she went off to be with Signy's husband, Sigurd.
Uther Pendragon. Uther. I had to look
Uther. I knew it started with an U.
But we're in Scandinavian.
I know. I was thinking Ulfr. Yeah.
Saxon mode.
Uther Pendragon.
Yes. And he
Yes.
disguised himself as the Duke of Cornwall. And
Right.
Jane, the wife of the Duke of Cornwall, accepted him thinking he was her husband.
Right.
Well, this is exactly the same, only reversed.
Right. Yeah, that used to happen in stories. It's poor women. So let's see.
But in this case, it's a poor man.
Yes, that's true. It's Sigmund.
Yep.
So Signy goes to her brother's hut, and where he's hidden. She had helped him hide in the forest, so Sigurd didn't know where he was. And she visits him, and she pretends, so she's disguised as this witch, and she pretends she's lost in the woods and asks him for his hospitality. He takes her in, as he should, because you're supposed to be hospitable. End up sleeping together, and she gives birth to Sinfjotli. Now, Sigmund did not know that he was Sinfjotli's father, but he trained the boy in secret. And then when he grew up, the two of them just went out on like an outlaw rampage, just robbing people and killing people. So this is a Viking story, so it's okay for our heroes to go out and rob and kill people.
It's even encouraged.
Yes.
Don't ask me why.
So 2 of the men that they had killed had wolf skins. And Sigmund and Sinfjotli put them on, and they became wolves. And they were even able to communicate with one another as wolves. Like they would bray, and then they could communicate.
Oh.
Yeah. And then they killed a bunch more people as wolves. So, and that's the end of the shape-shifting. There's a lot more to this story, but there's no more shape-shifting that I can remember. And
it is a saga indeed, and there are multiple versions of it, as I understand.
Yeah, especially the part with yeah. And then Sigmund is the last one to survive out of the whole family, and then he is the father of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, who we've mentioned before. He's a friend to the podcast. So that's a lot about shapeshifters and the hamr and your ability to shapeshift. I just love that. I think one of the reasons why I like to revisit the Viking Age and this idea of magic is that deep down, I wish there was magic in the world. I think there is magic in a way, but I really wish there was magic like this. So it's kind of fun to go back to a time when people did believe in magic and shapeshifting. That's just
I like
me.
to make that world real.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that was the hamr. And the next part is, well, it's not necessarily next. The other part is the hugr. And this is your inner essence. This is your personality and your temperament. This is your inner experiences. This is your inner thoughts, feelings, emotions, characteristics. This is all the stuff that makes you, you. So the hamr is the outer shell. The hugr is the inner stuff, the stuff that makes a person. And just like some gifted people could see or could shapeshift, there are gifted people who could see another person's hugr. So I guess it would be like seeing someone's aura. You know how there's people who will say, oh yeah, I can see an aura. It might be something similar. And then, so Odin has two ravens who are named Hugin and Munin, and Hugin's name is related to hugr. It means thought, or that's how it's mostly translated. Odin's ravens are also his fylgja, which is one of the other parts of the soul, and we'll get into the fylgja later. So certain people could leave behind their hugr as well as their hamr. So we talked about the shape-shifting and being able to leave your body and inhabit something else. So people could leave their hugr as well, even though I'm not 100% clear on what that would be like. Would that be like an astral projection, or is that what you do when you're in a trance?
Yeah, there's an awful lot. I think it would be like being in a trance.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and that with my shape shifting in my books, I do kind of try to grapple with that a little bit, where when Osa is in her falcon form, how much can she think? I mean, she kind of merges her mind with the falcon, and so she is able to think, but she also has many of the attributes and instincts of the falcon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Even in other fantasy books I've thought of, yeah, they sometimes they completely leave their human mind behind, but sometimes they keep some of their human thoughts. Yeah, that's a good point. Mm-hmm.
To me, it's like that you're actually projecting your mind into this creature. So to me, it's really, you must be able to keep some part of your own mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then they keep their human eyes.
Yes.
That is so...
They're recognized by their eyes, yeah.
And I don't know if I find that really cool or really creepy.
It's kind of creepy, but yeah. I mean, thinking about a falcon with human eyes,
that would be bizarre. Yeah, that would kind of freak me out.
Yes.
And then, like we're just talking, like witches could separate their hugr and their hamr. They could...
Mm-hmm.
They were really powerful. No wonder they ended up being afraid of them. No wonder the Christians were so scared of these sorceresses.
Yeah. And of course, the early Christians definitely believed in all this stuff. They didn't. It was much, much later that people became skeptical of magic.
Well, I guess even the Vikings were scared of them too, because there's lots of stories where they're afraid of these witches or they're trying to kill them, and because they were powerful. And in the Havamal, Odin, he's going through a whole list of spells of things that he knows, and in one stanza, in stanza 155, he says, I know a 10th spell. If the need arises at play in the air, I can cast this spell so that they get lost, so they can't find their skins, so they can't find their minds.
Yeah.
And this was translated by Jackson Crawford. It's the one I have. And I think that's really scary to imagine, like, as someone casting a spell so you can't find your skin or your mind.
Yeah.
How terrifying.
It's really terrifying.
Yeah. It's pretty chilling. You have anything more about the hugr?
No, not really, because it's all, kind of meshed in with the other. They're all aspects of the human being.
And the other one is the hamingja. And this is luck. Only this is not luck like we think of luck.
Right.
This was an extremely important part of a Viking's life. Especially, kings and warriors. The whole idea of luck was almost primost. And it was just the most important thing. If a king or a chieftain or somebody had good luck, he would bring people to him. And if he didn't have good luck, they would just go away.
That's right.
And I like what Neil Price said, and everyone's path in life was determined by fate, but rode on a wave of luck.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, I like that. Because we've talked about fate before, but I guess there's that independent part of their luck, because that can come and go.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
and your hamingja could even move around.
Yeah.
It had its own will, which I actually find that one kind of blows my mind that your luck could like literally get up and leave you. It could abandon you. So I guess that's what it means when your luck is run out. Like
Yep.
it's literally run out. So
Yep.
maybe that's where that phrase comes from. I don't know.
It probably is.
Yeah, imagine you're a Viking king or a warlord of some sort, and your luck literally gets up and like, I'm out, and runs away. And certain people could see that as well. They could see the hamingja, so they might be able to see your luck, like doing a runner. You're like, what is happening with this guy? So yeah, and it could be
Also,
inherited.
also this hamingja or luck had to do with like fertility of the crops. That's why a
Mm,
king had to have it because it was bestowed on the entire land that he ruled over.
that's right. Yeah.
And there is one story of a king voluntarily being sending himself up for sacrifice to end a famine.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that one too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, these successful kings, they had to have strong hamingjas. So,
There's a story about Olaf the woodcutter who was he was a king, but he was run out of Sweden, and so he took up residence in the middle of in the between Ostfold and Vestfold, and he started cutting trees down, and a lot of people from Sweden came and joined him because they didn't like the king who had displaced him in Sweden. And so they started a settlement there, and he was their king, but they ran out of food
mm,
and they sacrificed him. But then, after he was already dead, they realized that it was because they were overpopulated, not because
mm,
of his luck. But they
mm.
sacrificed him thinking his luck had run out. And if they sacrificed him, the luck would return, which it didn't.
Whoops.
Yeah, whoops, is right.
That's a big mistake.
So he's the progenitor of my character Olaf
Mm.
and Halfdan the Black, and also the ancestor of Harold Fairhair. So they eventually settled in Vestfold.
Yeah, and having the nickname the Lucky. Wait,
Leif the Lucky.
yes, Leif the Lucky. That would have been a great nickname. I mean, how?
Yeah,
But he really wasn't that lucky. He got thrown out of Norway or he
I
got thrown
know.
out of
Well, maybe it was a
Iceland.
self-proclaimed nickname.
Yeah.
I'm lucky, follow me.
Yeah, you're not supposed to give yourself a nickname.
No, that's true. But
One of my favorite nicknames was Thorolf Lousebeard. And I was thinking, gross.
he probably didn't give that one to himself.
No, like, who was even
Oh my
hanging out with
goodness.
this guy?
I'm
How
not kissing him.
Ugh. Yeah. Could you imagine if your lice was that bad that they actually nicknamed you Lousebeard? Yeah. So I guess I could see giving yourself a nickname that's a little better.
Yeah.
I love the Viking nicknames.
Yeah.
And the fourth and final part of the Viking soul is the fylgja. And this is probably one that more Westerners might understand because we're familiar with like Native American traditions of spirit animals and things like that. It's very similar. It's a guardian spirit animal with which every person is born. And they're always female spirits. So every person is born with a fylgja and it stays with you your entire life. Well, it should, but they can also leave. Even though people could not see their own fylgja, except maybe in dreams, it was often thought that the fylgja was like the animal representation of who that person was. So somebody who's a warrior might have a wolf as the fylgja, or I think some royalty have bears as fylgja. I don't know, you might have a fox or something like that. Or birds, especially birds of prey, like an eagle or a falcon or something like that. And like the hamingja, the fylgja could be inherited, and they could also reject you if they thought you were unworthy. All right, and the fylgja were probably ancestral spirits. So, and you have some more about that, don't you?
I do. So there's some overlap. Seeing your fylgja can foretell your death, your impending death. Because, as you said, normally people don't see their fylgja. But there's also stories of fylgja in which they were female human ancestors. So maybe there were two different definitions of fylgja. I don't know. But these guardian women were also known as the disir. But in some sagas, they're called fylgja, which means follower. The word fylgja means follower. These are following women. And the disir watch over their family members, and they bestow or personify hamingja, the luck. So in other words, it does kind of seem like there's two different kinds of fylgja here. So they personify this hamingja, the luck, and that luck and special power can be passed along in families and even loaned out to other people, as you mentioned earlier. So in the Hallfredr saga, a family dis, or female ancestor who were like goddesses, this dis followed Hallfred's ship when he crossed the sea. She was walking on water. She was a fully armed woman walking on water, following his ship.
Oh, I don't think I've ever read that one before.
Yeah, it's not a really well-known saga, but it's the picture to me of this giant woman, and these are always very large. And so she followed Hallfred's ship over the sea to where he moved when he moved to Iceland, and she appeared to him just before his death, and he asked her to go to his son, which apparently she did. So also in the Viga Glum saga, after the death of Glum's grandfather in Norway, Glum, who had moved to Iceland, dreamed that this enormous woman approached his house. She was taller than the mountains. Well, Glum invited her to stay, of course. Anything you want, lady.
Yeah.
But he called her his hamingja. So he didn't call her his fylgja. He didn't call her a dis. He called her his hamingja. So she embodied or personified his family luck, and he inherited it from his grandfather, who sent her from Norway. He died. It's very interesting. Yeah. So these ideas are all intertwined, and that's why it's, they're not that distinct. They're related to each other, just like parts of you as a person are all related and overlap. Your physical health affects your mental health and vice versa. You have your emotions and your critical thinking. Those are all related parts. So it doesn't make that, it's not that strange that they would be intertwined like that.
No, not at all. I love that idea that the fylgja would be like a representation of the hamingja.
Yes.
I like that.
And that's Neil Price. And in his book, The Viking Way, he goes into great depths of this and analyzes these stories. So a lot of those ideas come from him, as many other ideas come.
Yeah, if our listeners are interested, his books are really good.
They are.
He's excellent. And I've even found some of his lectures online, and he's a very good speaker as well. Really interesting.
He's at the University of Uppsala.
And when you were talking about if you see your fylgja, that means you're about to die. That reminded me of the Celtic mythology. If you see the Morrigan, it means you're about to die.
Yes.
Especially as in she's washing.
Yeah, washing bloody clothes.
The bloody clothes.
Bloody clothes. Yes.
Yeah. See, this is all that kind of stuff that I just love. I just love those things. Like, oh, you see this thing, and that means you're gonna die. Like, And another aspect of the fylgja. So we've mentioned Odin's ravens earlier, and that they are his fylgja. And in the poem Grimnismal, which is a really great poem, another thing, if people are interested in digging deeper, it's really easy to follow. It's Odin is captured. He goes to a king's hall, and the king against all laws of hospitality, throws Odin, who's in disguise, in the dungeon between two fires for like
Yes.
8 nights or something like that. The king's young son goes to give him a drink and talks to him, and Odin tells the boy all about like the different worlds of the gods. It's a lot of what we know about Norse mythology comes from this poem. And it's really easy to read. But anyway, in one stanza, Odin reveals a particular vulnerability. He says, "Thought and memory, my ravens fly every day the world over. Each day I fear that thought might not return, but I fear more for memory," which it always kind of gives me chills. Like, oh, he's
Yeah.
so afraid his thought and his memory might not come back.
And it makes you wonder a little bit about, dementia, whether
Yeah,
this is
exactly.
dementia.
Mhm. And imagine, and the fact that he fears more for memory says
Yeah.
something about this oral culture. If you can't remember the stories, if you can't remember your ancestors, that's a huge
Everything
loss.
was transmitted by memory, even their
Mhm.
laws. The law speaker had to know the laws by heart. And every year at the annual thing, he had to recite 1/3 of the laws
Wow.
for the assembly. So memory was really, really important.
Really important. And I
Yes.
think that really comes out in that particular stanza.
It also, really points up the risks of shape shifting.
Oh, yeah.
And he's earlier you talked about the spell in the Havamal, where he knows a spell that can make it so that the witches can't find their way back to their mind and their memory. So this echoes that.
Yeah. That'd be a really cool story to write about a witch who gets
Was.
lost. She can't
Yeah,
find her way back. And what happens? What happens to you if you can't find your way back? Especially
right,
if you're not, if your body's not dead.
right.
hmm Well, I've been rewatching the show, Air, Avatar, The Last Airbender, the
Oh
original
yeah.
animated one. It's an excellent show. Excellent. Even though it was made for kids, it is so well done. And they have so many good storylines and everything. And so the avatar, he can go into the spirit world, but he has to leave his body behind. And even in that show, his body is vulnerable when he's in the spirit world. So
Mhm.
it's interesting.
Well,
It
and
had
the
this,
Sami had that belief, and when their shamans would go into the spirit world, that he had helpers who would sit there and chant and drum and help him come back to the world. And I portray that in my books when the vulvas, who we believe there's some belief that they were educated by the Sami, and that's where they got their magic. We don't know for sure, but they were influenced for sure by that.
mhm.
And so her 9 apprentices are there to help her return to her body and find her way. It's considered a very real threat.
Sure. And these guardian spirits like the fylgja. I mean, they're in
Yeah.
so many pre-Christian belief systems all over. I mean, we're most familiar living in the US, especially me. I live in the Southwest. There's with the native cultures, it's a big thing.
Well, and even in Christianity, they believe in guardian angels.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. I think maybe we all want to just think that there's somebody else looking out for us.
Yeah.
That reminds me of this is a little divergence, but when I was probably 19, 20 years old, maybe a little older. Anyway, it was early 20s. Um, I was driving home from work. I was working at like a record and video store, and we didn't close till like 11. So it must have been around midnight, and I was driving home. Roads were completely empty, but I was at a light, and the light turned green. And normally I'm kind of a speed demon when I drive. And normally I would just take off like a shot. And something held me back from just going when the light turned green. And just as I would have reached the middle of the intersection, if I had gone like I normally would, here comes a car, runs the red light, going as
Oh my
fast as you can
gosh.
imagine, would have completely run right into me, probably would have killed me, if not hurt
No
me
doubt.
severely. Something stayed my foot from putting on the gas. And it was so weird. I still remember it all these decades later that had happened, so maybe we do have
Maybe
something looking after. Maybe my fylgja was like, whoa,
it could have been.
or the hamingja. So yeah, so with the Judeo-Christian version of like the body and the soul, where the soul goes on and the body doesn't. And the Vikings believe that for the most part, what we understand, like your whole body went with you when you died. Well, we don't really know what happened to women when they died, but when these warriors died, it wasn't like a piece of them went to Valhalla. They went to Valhalla. I mean,
And actually, we do sort of know about women because the Disir are the
yeah.
female ancestors. They are the female dead, and they watch over the family. Now, we don't know if that pertains to all women or only certain special women that die. And there's also some interesting ideas about whether to burn the body, whether to cremate the body or bury it. And it kind of appears that most people were cremated, but special people were buried because as long as their body stayed on the earth, they would continue to bless the land. And so that all starts with, the god Freyr, who was buried in this mound. He was a Swedish king, and they kept pouring gold and silver into this mound, saying he was still alive and continuing to bless the land. And there's the story of Halfdan the Black, whose body was dismembered so that different districts could all bury a part of his body. His head went to one place, his legs went to another place, and that was because he was such a prosperous king that they wanted him to continue to bless the land. And so that's why there these big ship burials, because that's based on the whole thing about Freyr and his mound.
And then that makes me think of BJ 581, where she was buried at the fortress, and she was up looking out over the lake
and continuing to defend,
to protect them.
She must have been quite a person.
Gosh, yeah. Well, and there's a story of Helgi Hundingsbana, and he returns to his burial mound, and he actually has relations with his wife.
I remember that.
There wasn't anything wrong with his body, so.
Well, and then of course we've gone over in other episodes The Walking Dead.
Yes, there's that. Yeah,
they turn blue or black, and they're ravenously hungry, which you might be if you'd been locked in a mound for a week or so and ran out of your sacrificial food. I don't know.
Maybe. And of course, in Valhalla, these men are there. They fight, they eat, they drink. If they're hurt, they get healed up again. And then when the end comes, when Ragnarok comes, it's not like they're just spirits that rush off to fight. These are actual fully embodied, fully armed men.
Yep.
Yeah. And the Einherjar are not spirits. These are men. These are warriors. So yeah, it's different. It's really interesting. Yeah, well, they couldn't have buried everyone. There wouldn't have been enough space in those mounds. They had to reserve it for special people.
Yeah, and it makes a certain amount of sense too, that they believe that when you're burned, your spirit ascends, and when you're buried, you remain your body remains on earth, and you remain in contact with the living. So. Yeah, it's very interesting to think about what their beliefs must have been. And we can only imagine.
You just talking about the Disir, and that's what happens with women, or at least some women when they die. So now I'm like just taking notes. Like now I have an idea for something that I'm writing right now. My main character's name is actually Disa, and she has some magical abilities, or she's going to discover she has some magical abilities.
Oh, that sounds
really and I good. Love this idea of the Disir maybe looking out for her. So
yes.
Yeah. So now our talk has given me some creative ideas. Yeah. Which I love. I love that inspiration comes from anywhere or anything. And it's one of the reasons why I like doing this, is because digging back into the research, as we've mentioned before, we did a lot of research to begin with, but if you don't go back to it occasionally, you forget some things,
You
or
sure
maybe
do.
something new, like along the way. Now something new is going to strike my attention that maybe I wasn't even on my radar,
Well,
five
so
or six
often
years
I
ago.
remember the idea or the incident, but I can't remember where I read it or where it came from. So then I have to go back and find that, which is what's great about this. This podcast, we really try to name our sources. That helps me a lot.
It helps me a lot too. All right. Anything else that we didn't go over?
Oh, one thing really quick. When they talk about Ragnarok, everybody dies except Freya. So there's some talk that Freya survives Ragnarok to start a new world. And I don't have the source for that because it just popped right into my head. I'll have to look it up, but it's in I think it's in one of the poems.
Oh, okay. And a couple of
where they talk
Odin's
about
son, Odin's
Ragnarok, and they describe it, and they talk about Fenrir and the nail ship of nails. They talk about you got to burn your nail parings because otherwise the enemy will make it into a ship of nails to attack. And
is that Voluspa?
Anyway.
Is it in Voluspa?
It might, yes.
Or Grimnismal, one of those, maybe.
I think it's Voluspa because she's the one who describes the end of the world.
Yeah.
And then, so anyway, I have to look it up though to be sure, but I'm pretty sure that that's where they talk about Freya surviving it.
And is it one of Thor's sons? One of Thor's sons, Magni, makes it. Yeah, I know a couple of their sons make it. Well, speaking of Freya, next month, we're going to have a nice discussion about the female goddesses. And we've talked about Freya pretty regularly because she's the one who's mentioned the most in the stories. But there's several others that we haven't really gotten to talk about in any detail. I mean, some of them there isn't a lot of detail about them.
Nobody knows much about them, but we can expand as much as we can.
We will explore them. So that'll be in our next episode.
That will be fun.
All right. Well, thank you. This was great. It was good to see you.
It was good to see you.
All right. And we'll see you next time.
Yep.
Bye. Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, KS, at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.